Behind the gilded portraits and ceremonial crowns of one of Britain's most influential monarchs lies a story that historians have whispered about for centuries. King James I of England, James VI of Scotland, ruled over 4 kingdoms, authored the King James Bible, and fathered the future of the Stuart dynasty. Yet beneath this public facade burned passions that would scandalize his court, enrage his nobles, and ultimately reshape the very foundations of royal power in Britain. This is not merely the story of a king's private desires, but a tale of political intrigue, religious upheaval, and the dangerous intersection of personal longing and absolute authority. In an age when a monarch's every gesture could spark rebellion or war, James dared to love openly, passionately, and without regard for the consequences that would echo through generations. The man they called the wisest fool in Christendom would prove that even kings are slaves to the human heart. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal duty, masculine friendship, and the price of power in the brutal court of early 17th century England. From the misty highlands of Scotland to the opulent chambers of Whitehall Palace, we'll trace a path of forbidden desire that nearly toppled kingdoms and forever changed the nature of English monarchy. In the year 1566, as Protestant Scotland writhed under religious conflict and political chaos, a child was born who would one day wear 4 crowns and rule over millions. James Charles Stuart entered a world where survival meant navigating between Catholic conspiracies, Puritan reformers, and Scottish nobles who viewed regicide as a viable political tool. His father, Lord Darnley, had been murdered when James was barely 8 months old, blown to smithereens in a mysterious explosion at Kirkhoe Field that left his body strangely unmarked in a nearby garden, suggesting he had been strangled before the blast. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, fled to England seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth I, only to find herself imprisoned for 19 years before losing her head to the executioner's axe. Young James learned early that royal blood offered no protection against political necessity, and that even the bonds between mother and child meant nothing when weighed against reasons of state. These lessons would shape his understanding of power, loyalty, and the terrible loneliness that comes with absolute authority. The Scotland of James's youth was a land torn between the old Catholic ways and John Knox's fierce Presbyterian reforms. Popery, Puritans, and witches, as contemporary observers noted, seemed to lurk behind every castle wall and church door. The boy king grew up surrounded by regents who fought bloody civil wars over his custody, each faction claiming to act in his best interests while pursuing their own political agendas. By age 12, he had witnessed more executions, betrayals, and political murders than most men see in a lifetime. In this atmosphere of suspicion and religious paranoia, young James learned to read men's souls as carefully as he studied scripture. His tutors, George Buchanan and Peter Young, were among the finest scholars in Europe, training him in classical languages, theology, and political theory. Yet they also filled his mind with stories of his mother's alleged crimes, teaching him to view her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked passion and Catholic intrigue. As he approached manhood, James began to display the contradictions that would mark his entire reign. Brilliant beyond measure, he spoke Latin, Greek, French, and English with equal fluency, yet socially awkward and physically ungainly. Contemporary accounts describe him as slobbering when excited, unable to control his limbs properly, walking with an unsteady gait that made him appear constantly on the verge of falling. His tongue seemed too large for his mouth, causing a slight lisp that became more pronounced when he grew emotional. Yet those who witnessed his intellectual prowess knew they were in the presence of genius. James could debate theology with learned bishops, compose poetry that rivaled the best of his age, and demonstrate an understanding of statecraft that left seasoned diplomats amazed. He wrote treatises on witchcraft, divine right monarchy, and the nature of kingship that would influence political thought for centuries. Anthony Weldon would later savage him as a drooling fool, but Weldon wrote from the bitter perspective of a dismissed courtier seeking revenge. The young king also displayed early signs of the intense emotional attachments that would define his adult relationships. He formed passionate friendships with certain boys at court, writing them letters filled with endearments and becoming inconsolably depressed when they were absent. These childhood patterns, intense devotion followed by jealous possessiveness, would repeat themselves throughout his life with increasingly dramatic consequences. James's education in the classics introduced him to the Greek and Roman traditions of masculine friendship, where emotional and even physical intimacy between men was not merely accepted, but celebrated as the highest form of human relationship. Plato's Symposium, Cicero's letters to Atticus, and the military partnerships described in Plutarch's Lives provided intellectual frameworks for understanding intense male bonds. In a culture that viewed women as intellectually inferior and emotionally unstable, these classical models offered attractive alternatives to heterosexual relationships. The year was 1579, and into the Scottish court walked a man who would forever alter the trajectory of James's life and reign. Esme Stuart, Earl of Lennox, arrived from France as a sophisticated 37-year-old courtier with dark eyes, refined manners, and a charm that immediately captivated the 13-year-old king. Stuart was married with children, Catholic in a Protestant realm, and everything the Scottish nobility feared in a royal favourite. Stuart represented everything the isolated young king had never experienced: continental sophistication, cultural refinement, and most importantly, genuine affection unmarked by political calculation. Where James's Scottish nobles treated him with formal deference masking obvious ambition, Stuart seemed to offer friendship for its own sake. The Frenchman brought gifts of books, artwork, and stories of the wider world beyond Scotland's borders, opening intellectual vistas that the boy king had only imagined. What happened next would establish a pattern that would define James's relationships for the rest of his life. The teenage king became utterly infatuated with the older man, composing sonnets in his honor and displaying affection so public and intense that the court buzzed with scandalized whispers. James would touch Stuart's hand during council meetings, seek his counsel on matters far beyond his experience, and spend hours in private conversation that left observers wondering exactly what passed between them. The physical manifestations of James's devotion shocked even the relatively permissive standards of Renaissance court culture. He would lean against Stuart during public ceremonies, adjust the older man's clothing with intimate familiarity, and whisper in his ear during formal dinners while completely ignoring other guests. Foreign ambassadors included detailed descriptions of these displays in their dispatches home, clearly viewing them as politically significant rather than merely personal eccentricities. The sonnets James wrote for Esme Stuart reveal a passion that transcends conventional friendship or even the elevated language of Renaissance court poetry. "Since thought is free, think what thou will," he penned, "but be secret and think none ill." The verses speak of devotion that dare not speak its name, of longing that must be hidden from hostile eyes, and of a connection that the young king clearly viewed as both spiritual and physical. Other poems from this period describe sleepless nights spent thinking of Stuart, jealousy when the earl spoke with other courtiers, and desperate pleas for reassurance of continued affection. These were not the formal dedications of a monarch to a loyal subject, but the intimate expressions of a heart wholly given over to desire. The classical influences in James's education provided literary models for such expressions, but the raw emotion behind them came from a much more personal source. The Protestant nobility watched this relationship with growing alarm. Here was their young king, heir to John Knox's reformed Scotland, falling under the influence of a Catholic Frenchman whose very presence seemed to threaten everything they had fought to achieve. Lord James Douglas, Earl of Morton, and his allies began to plot not just Stuart's removal, but the king's own imprisonment if necessary to break what they viewed as an unnatural and dangerous bond. Stuart's own letters from this period, preserved in French archives, reveal a man walking a dangerous tightrope between genuine affection for James and awareness of the political realities surrounding their relationship. He wrote to friends in France about the young king's extraordinary attachment and his own efforts to channel that devotion in politically useful directions. Whether Stuart reciprocated James's romantic feelings or merely exploited them remains a matter of historical debate. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal. In August 1582, Protestant lords led by the Earl of Gowrie seized the 16-year-old king during what appeared to be a routine hunting expedition. The Ruthven Raid, as it became known, was nothing less than a coup designed to sever James from his beloved Esme and force the Earl into exile. For nearly a year, James remained a prisoner in his own kingdom, watching helplessly as his enemies dismantled everything Stuart had built. The psychological impact of this imprisonment on the adolescent king cannot be overstated. Confined to Ruthven Castle, cut off from all contact with Stuart, and forced to issue proclamations denouncing his former favorite, James experienced what contemporary accounts describe as a complete emotional collapse. He refused food for days at a time, spent hours staring out windows toward France, where Stuart had fled, and had to be physically restrained from attempting escape. The accusations against Esme Stuart reveal the sexual paranoia that surrounded the king's relationships throughout his reign. The conspirators openly accused Stuart of seducing James into carnal lust, of corrupting the young monarch's morals through wicked and ungodly practices, and of leading him into Catholic apostasy through physical as well as spiritual manipulation. Whether these charges reflected actual knowledge or merely projected fears, they demonstrate how clearly contemporaries understood the intimate nature of the relationship. Religious reformers like Andrew Melville used the Stuart affair as evidence of the corrupting influence of Catholic sophistication on Protestant virtue. They argued that James's unnatural attachment to Stuart proved the degenerative effects of papist influence, linking sexual deviance with religious heresy in ways that would echo through centuries of anti-Catholic propaganda. The young king found himself not just politically isolated, but morally condemned by the very religious authorities who claimed to serve his interests. When Stuart was finally forced to flee Scotland, James fell into a depression so profound that courtiers feared for his life. Letters from this period describe a young man consumed by grief, unable to concentrate on state business, and displaying symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe clinical depression. The king, who would later be mocked as emotionally cold, was, in his youth, capable of devastating passion and equally devastating loss. Stuart's exile to France, where he died within months of leaving Scotland, provided James with his first harsh lesson in the costs of royal love. The man he had elevated above all others, for whom he had written poetry and risked his throne, was gone forever, sacrificed to political necessity and noble ambition. Yet rather than learning to suppress his desires, James seemed to draw a different conclusion entirely. If he was to survive as king while maintaining the relationships he craved, he would need to accumulate enough power to make his enemies think twice before moving against his favorites. The trauma of losing Stuart would influence every subsequent relationship in James's life. The boy who had been imprisoned by his own nobles would grow into a man determined never to be so vulnerable again, yet also determined never to abandon those he loved to the mercies of political enemies. This contradiction between the need for absolute power and the desire for intimate connection would define his reign and ultimately reshape the nature of English monarchy. The death of Esme Stuart in France, reportedly of a fever but possibly by poison administered by Protestant agents, reached James just as he was beginning to assert his independence from the Ruthven conspirators. The news sent him into another spiral of grief and rage, but also crystallized his determination to escape the control of the Scottish nobility. In June 1583, he engineered his own escape from captivity, beginning a campaign to establish his personal rule that would last for the remainder of his Scottish reign. By 1603, Elizabeth I lay dying without direct heirs, and James of Scotland prepared to claim the English throne that would make him the most powerful monarch in Europe. The union of the English and Scottish crowns fulfilled his lifelong dream of creating a unified British kingdom, but it also placed him under the intense scrutiny of a foreign court, notorious for its sophistication and intrigue. English nobles, accustomed to the imperious Virgin Queen, would now serve a king whose personal habits and romantic inclinations were about to become matters of international consequence. The journey south to London in the spring of 1603 revealed both James's excitement at his new prospects and his continued vulnerability to masculine beauty. Among the English nobles who came north to pay homage was a contingent of young men whose looks and manners immediately caught the new king's attention. Contemporary accounts describe James's obvious delight in these encounters, his lingering conversations with particularly attractive courtiers, and his promises of future favor that set tongues wagging before he had even reached his new capital. James's first sight of London overwhelmed him with its size, wealth, and sophistication. Where Edinburgh was a provincial capital of perhaps 30,000 souls, London boasted over 200,000 inhabitants and served as the commercial and cultural center of Europe's most dynamic economy. The English court offered opportunities for luxury, learning, and companionship that dwarfed anything available in Scotland. For a king whose desires ran toward beauty and refinement, it was a paradise of possibilities. Yet it was also a minefield where every gesture would be analyzed, every friendship scrutinized, and every sign of royal favor potentially weaponized by political enemies. The English nobility had grown accustomed to managing Elizabeth through a complex system of faction and favor, and they had no intention of allowing this foreign king to upset established hierarchies. James would need to navigate these treacherous waters while maintaining the relationships that made life worth living. James's marriage to Anne of Denmark had produced the heirs necessary to secure the succession, 7 living children from 9 pregnancies, yet courtiers noted that the royal couple maintained separate households and seemed to interact primarily during state occasions. Anne, intelligent and strong-willed, appeared to understand and perhaps even accommodate her husband's emotional investments elsewhere. She had witnessed his passionate friendships in Scotland and seemed to accept them as part of the price of queenship. Contemporary accounts suggest Anne formed her own intimate friendships with ladies of the court, while James pursued his increasingly public relationships with beautiful young men. The Queen's correspondence reveals a woman who found fulfillment in architectural projects, theatrical productions, and the company of female favorites who shared her interests in literature and the arts. This arrangement, unusual by the standards of royal marriage, seemed to work for both parties. The New English court provided James with access to a pool of educated, ambitious, and physically attractive men that Scotland had never offered. Wealthy families throughout the kingdom began sending their most promising sons to seek their fortunes in the royal presence, creating a constant stream of potential favorites for the king's consideration. James reveled in this abundance of choice, often spending hours interviewing young men seeking positions in the royal household. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Robert Carr, a young Scotsman whose beauty and charm would soon make him the most powerful man in England after the king himself. Carr had come south with James's initial retinue, but had attracted little attention until a riding accident during a tournament in 1607 changed both their lives forever. Thrown from his horse in full view of the royal box, Carr broke his leg so severely that bone protruded through the skin, causing spectators to gasp in horror. James, moved by the young man's pain, and perhaps struck by his physical appeal, even in such circumstances, immediately leaped from the royal box and rushed to Car's side. Ignoring protocol and his own dignity, the king cradled the injured man's head in his lap while shouting for his personal physicians. This public display of concern for a relatively minor courtier sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility, who recognized the signs of royal infatuation from previous experience. The king's order that Car be moved to apartments adjacent to the royal chambers, ostensibly for convenient medical care, fooled no one familiar with James's patterns of behavior. As Car recovered over the following weeks, James began visiting daily, then hourly, then seemed barely able to tear himself away from the injured man's bedside. Courtiers noted the transformation in both men, Car's obvious gratitude deepening into something more complex, and James's medical concern evolving into unmistakable romantic obsession. What began as royal compassion quickly transformed into the most intense relationship of James's reign. As Car's leg healed and he began moving about the palace on crutches, James insisted on personally assisting him, supporting his weight during walks in the garden and helping him in and out of chairs with a tenderness that shocked observers. The king, who maintained rigid ceremonial distance from even his closest advisors, seemed incapable of keeping his hands off this beautiful young Scotsman. Car's own letters from this period, written to friends and family in Scotland, reveal his awareness of the extraordinary opportunity that his accident had provided. He wrote of the king's infinite goodness and tender care, but also of his own determination to merit such favor through loyal service. Whether this service extended to intimate relations remains unclear from Car's circumspect correspondence, but his rapid transformation from minor courtier to royal confidant suggests a relationship that transcended conventional boundaries. The physical manifestations of James's infatuation with Car became the talk of both the English and foreign courts. The Venetian ambassador wrote detailed descriptions of the king's behavior. His Majesty caresses him publicly and upon the slightest occasion kisses his hands, touches his face, and displays such marks of affection as would be excessive even between husband and wife. Such displays went far beyond the formal courtesies expected between monarch and subject. French and Spanish diplomats included similar observations in their reports, clearly viewing James's behavior as politically significant intelligence about the English court's power structures. They noted that access to the king increasingly required Car's approval, that state business was often conducted in the young man's presence, and that James seemed incapable of making important decisions without consulting his favorite. This level of dependence alarmed foreign powers and English nobles alike. The letters between James and Car during this period reveal a relationship of extraordinary intimacy and emotional intensity. James addressed Car as the man I loved above all men living, language that shocked even the relatively permissive standards of Jacobean court correspondence. When diplomatic business required their separation, James wrote daily letters filled with endearments, complaints about loneliness, and detailed descriptions of his activities that read more like correspondence between lovers than between king and courtier. One particularly revealing letter from James to Car, written during a brief separation in 1609, contains the plaintive confession, "I cannot content myself without sending you this present, praying God that I may have a joyful and comfortable meeting with you, and that we may make at this Christmas a new marriage ever to be kept hereafter." The reference to marriage between two men, even metaphorically, was unprecedented in royal correspondence, and suggests a relationship that both parties understood in conjugal terms. Car's meteoric rise through the ranks of nobility reflected James's determination to elevate his favorite, regardless of opposition from established families. From gentleman of the bedchamber, Car became Viscount Rochester in 1611, then Earl of Somerset in 1613, accumulating wealth and titles at a pace that left hereditary nobles breathless with indignation. Each promotion was accompanied by grants of land, monopolies, and cash payments that made Carr one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. James appointed Carr Lord Chamberlain in 1614, giving him control over access to the royal presence, a power that Carr allegedly used both to enrich himself and to punish those who had slighted him during his humble beginnings. Contemporary accounts describe a man intoxicated by his rapid ascent, demanding elaborate ceremonies of deference from nobles who had previously ignored him, and charging substantial fees for arranging audiences with the king. The corruption that surrounded Carr's administration of royal access became a source of growing resentment among the nobility and parliament. Members of parliament complained that they could not present petitions or conduct business without paying bribes to the king's favorite, while foreign ambassadors reported that English foreign policy seemed to be for sale to the highest bidder. These complaints reached James, but he seemed unwilling or unable to rein in his favorite's excesses. Yet beneath the public splendor and political power lay a more complex emotional reality. Carr's own letters reveal a man increasingly uncomfortable with the intensity of James's devotion and the expectations that came with royal favor. He complained to friends about the king's possessiveness, his demands for constant attention, and his jealous reactions to Carr's friendships with other courtiers. What had begun as gratitude was evolving into something approaching resentment. The turning point in the relationship came when Carr became entangled with Frances Howard, Countess of Essex, in one of the most scandalous affairs of the Jacobean era. Howard, a beautiful and ambitious woman trapped in an unconsummated marriage to the Earl of Essex, sought an annulment that would allow her to marry Carr. The case became a public spectacle involving accusations of impotence, virginity examinations conducted by panels of matrons, and eventually murder when Sir Thomas Overbury, who opposed the match, died mysteriously in the Tower of London. James's reaction to Carr's romantic entanglement revealed the possessive, jealous nature of his attachment to his favorites. When Carr began spending more time with Frances Howard and less in the royal presence, the king's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would summon Carr at odd hours for no apparent purpose, demand detailed explanations for his absences, and fly into rages when his favorite seemed distracted during their private meetings. Court observers noted that James appeared to view Howard as a rival for Carr's affections, rather than simply the object of his favorite's natural heterosexual desires. The situation deteriorated further when Carr, now thoroughly absorbed in his romance with Frances Howard, began refusing to perform some of the more intimate duties of his position. Most significantly, he stopped sleeping in the king's bedchamber, a privilege and responsibility he had maintained for several years. James's response was both revealing and desperate. He declared that he would not be shunned by any man, regardless of rank or favor, and threatened to find other companions who would appreciate royal friendship. As the Overbury murder trial unfolded throughout 1615 and 1616, with both Carr and Frances Howard ultimately convicted of poisoning the knight who had opposed their marriage, James faced the most difficult decision of his reign. His favorite, the man he had elevated from obscurity to the heights of nobility, stood accused of cold-blooded murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Love letters between Carr and Howard discussing Overbury as an obstacle, payments to the apothecary who supplied the poison, and testimony from servants who had administered the fatal doses. James's decision to commute their death sentences to imprisonment in the Tower revealed both his lingering affection for Carr and his growing recognition that the favorite's usefulness had ended. The king could not bring himself to execute the man he had loved above all others, but neither could he ignore the demands for justice from Parliament and the people. The compromise satisfied no one and left James politically weakened and emotionally devastated. The fall of Robert Carr marked the end of James's youth and the beginning of a more calculating approach to royal favorites. The pattern established with Esme Stuart, passionate devotion followed by political necessity and ultimate abandonment, had repeated itself with even more dramatic consequences. James had learned that love was a luxury that could cost not just personal happiness, but the stability of the realm itself. In 1614, even as the Car affair was reaching its scandalous climax, fate delivered what courtiers would later call the most beautiful man in England. George Villiers appeared at court with advantages his predecessors had lacked: youth, extraordinary physical beauty, and most importantly, a family ambitious enough to engineer his rise, but practical enough to avoid the spectacular self-destruction that had claimed Robert Carr. Contemporary descriptions of Villiers read like romantic poetry rather than court chronicles. Standing over 6 feet tall with perfectly proportioned limbs, golden hair that caught the light like spun metal, and features that combined masculine strength with feminine delicacy, Villiers possessed what one observer called a pleasing manner and graceful deportment that won all hearts. His portraits, which survive in remarkable number, emphasize his long, elegant legs, narrow waist, and the kind of androgynous beauty that appealed equally to men and women of the sophisticated Jacobean court. The Villiers family had studied the rise and fall of previous royal favorites with calculating precision. George's mother, Mary Villiers, was a formidable woman who understood that success required not just physical attraction, but political acumen, religious orthodoxy, and the ability to serve the king's needs while advancing broader family interests. Unlike the Catholic Esme Stuart or the politically naive Robert Carr, George Villiers would be carefully prepared for the role of royal favorite. The family invested heavily in George's education and presentation, hiring the finest tutors to perfect his French, improve his dancing, and teach him the subtle arts of courtly conversation. They studied James's preferences and tailored their son's appearance and manner accordingly. Even George's famous legs, which became the subject of court gossip and artistic celebration, were enhanced through careful attention to his stockings, shoes, and the cut of his doublets. James's attraction to Villiers was immediate and overwhelming, but it was also different from his previous infatuations. Where Stuart had been fatherly and Carr passionate, Villiers seemed to offer something approaching genuine partnership. At 21, he was young enough to inspire protective instincts, but mature enough to understand the political complexities of their relationship. Most importantly, he appeared to genuinely enjoy the king's company, rather than merely enduring it for advancement. Within months of their first meeting, Villiers had been appointed Gentleman of the Bedchamber, a position that granted him intimate daily access to the king's person. But it was the emotional connection that truly distinguished this relationship from James's previous infatuations. Court observers noted that the king seemed more relaxed and happy than he had been in years, while Villiers displayed a natural ease in royal company that suggested genuine affection rather than calculated performance. The evidence for the physical nature of James's relationship with George Villiers emerges not from court gossip or enemy propaganda, but from their own correspondence. A letter from Villiers, recounting a night spent at Farnham Castle near the end of 1615, contains a phrase that has puzzled and titillated historians for centuries. The bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog. The reference to Villiers as James's dog, a term of endearment the king used frequently, combined with the image of their bodies so intertwined that traditional sleeping arrangements were disrupted, suggests an intimacy that transcends conventional friendship. The letter continues with Villiers describing their shared accommodations during royal progresses, noting that "we cannot be long asunder," and that the king's love is such as never was equaled. These casual references to physical proximity and emotional intensity provide rare glimpses into the private reality behind the public displays of royal favor. Unlike the carefully constructed official correspondence between monarch and courtier, these personal letters reveal two men comfortable with an intimacy that both understood and cherished. Even more revealing are James's own letters to Villiers, particularly those written in 1624, as the king's health declined and he sensed his own mortality approaching. These documents, preserved in state archives and family collections, contain language so explicitly conjugal that even sympathetic historians struggle to interpret them platonically. James writes of praying for a joyful and comfortable meeting with Villiers, proposes celebrating a new marriage at Christmas, and most remarkably addresses Villiers as "my sweet child and wife." The 1624 correspondence continues in this vein throughout several letters, with James declaring that he would rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you. The use of widow is particularly striking, as it explicitly casts their relationship in matrimonial terms, while acknowledging that James's actual wife, Queen Anne, had died 3 years earlier. The king seemed to view Villiers, not Anne, as his true spouse and life partner. These letters also revealed James's terror at the prospect of losing another favorite to the political machinations that had destroyed his previous relationships. He begs Villiers to remain loyal, promises him eternal devotion, and warns against listening to enemies who would poison their bond. The aging king, now approaching 60 and increasingly frail, clung to his beautiful favorite with the desperation of a man who had learned that love and power made dangerous companions. The sexual content of some letters becomes even more explicit when James writes about their physical separation during Villiers' diplomatic missions. "I desire only to live in this world for your sake," James confesses in one letter, "and I had rather live banished in any part of the earth with you than live a sorrowful widow's life without you." He goes on to describe dreams of their reunion that contain unmistakably erotic imagery, writing of embracing Villiers as a loving husband should do to his dear wife, and of the sweet comfort he finds in their shared bed. Under James's patronage, George Villiers rose to heights that dwarfed even Robert Carr's spectacular ascent. Created Duke of Buckingham in 1623, he became the first non-royal duke in English history, wielding power that extended far beyond the traditional limits of court favorites. Buckingham controlled government appointments, directed foreign policy, commanded military expeditions, and accumulated wealth that rivaled the crown itself. Yet unlike his predecessors, he managed to retain James's absolute devotion while building a power base independent of royal favor. The secret of Buckingham's success lay in his understanding that James needed more than physical companionship or even romantic love. The aging king required a partner capable of sharing the burdens of rule while protecting the dynasty he had worked so hard to establish. Buckingham cultivated careful relationships with Prince Charles, the heir apparent, and Princess Elizabeth, ensuring that his influence would survive James's death. He also married strategically to Catherine Manners, daughter of the Earl of Rutland, producing heirs who would carry his bloodline into future generations. Buckingham's marriage in 1620 created a potential crisis in his relationship with James, who had watched previous favorites drift away as they established their own families. However, Buckingham handled the situation with remarkable skill, including both James and the royal family in wedding preparations, and continuing to spend most of his nights in the king's chambers, even after taking a wife. Catherine Manners, for her part, seemed to understand and accept the extraordinary nature of her husband's relationship with the king. Foreign ambassadors marveled at the unprecedented access Buckingham enjoyed to state secrets and royal decision-making. The Venetian envoy reported that nothing is done without Buckingham, while the French ambassador noted that the Duke sleeps in the king's chamber and shares all his secrets. This level of intimacy in matters of state represented a radical departure from traditional monarchy, where even queens were excluded from certain government deliberations. The relationship between James and Buckingham also displayed a domestic quality absent from the king's previous favorites. They shared meals privately, attended theatre performances together, and even disciplined each other's children as if they were members of the same family. When James grew ill, Buckingham nursed him personally, sleeping in the royal bedchamber and monitoring his health with the devotion of a spouse rather than a subject. Parliament's growing opposition to Buckingham's power reflected broader anxieties about the nature of royal government under James. Members complained that they could no longer distinguish between the king's will and his favourites' preferences, that England's foreign policy seemed designed to serve Buckingham's interests rather than national ones, and that the traditional mechanisms of royal council had been replaced by the pillow talk of lovers. These complaints would eventually contribute to the constitutional crisis that engulfed Charles I's reign. The relationship between James and Buckingham during the king's final illness reveals the depth of their emotional bond and its political implications. As James's health deteriorated in early 1625, Buckingham essentially took over the daily administration of government while maintaining a constant vigil at the royal bedside. Foreign ambassadors reported that they could no longer distinguish between royal commands and ducal orders, as Buckingham seemed to speak with the king's voice and authority. Contemporary accounts of James's death describe Buckingham's behavior as that of a grieving spouse rather than a loyal subject. He refused to leave the king's side even when physicians suggested that rest might speed recovery, insisted on personally administering medicines, and was reportedly found weeping over James's body when the king finally expired on March 27, 1625. The Duke's grief seemed genuine and profound, suggesting that whatever political advantages he had gained from their relationship, his affection for James was real. The transition to Charles I's reign revealed the extraordinary institutional changes that James's relationships with his favourites had wrought. Charles, who had grown up viewing Buckingham almost as a stepfather, continued the Duke's unprecedented access to royal power while maintaining the intimate friendship that had developed during his father's reign. Although there is no evidence of sexual intimacy between Charles and Buckingham, their political and personal partnership remained remarkably close. Buckingham's influence over Charles proved even more controversial than his relationship with James had been. The new king's subjects expected that royal marriage and generational change would end the Duke's dominance, but instead found themselves ruled by what appeared to be a partnership between two men who had shared James's bed and affections. This continuity from father to son created unique tensions in English political culture, where royal favourites were traditionally expected to rise and fall with individual monarchs. The assassination of Buckingham in 1628 by John Felton, a disgruntled naval officer who blamed the Duke for England's military failures, represented the violent end of an era that had begun with Esme Stuart nearly 50 years earlier. Felton's act was celebrated in the streets of London, where ballads and pamphlets hailed him as a patriot who had rid England of its most hated man. Yet the reaction also revealed the deep divisions that James's relationships with male favourites had created in English society. Charles I's response to Buckingham's murder, inconsolable sorrow, followed by years of vengeful pursuit of anyone connected to the assassination, demonstrated the degree to which the Duke had become integral to Stuart family identity. The king's behavior suggested that he too had lost someone irreplaceable, not merely a political ally, but a genuine family member whose death left a void that could never be filled. The integration of Buckingham's children into the royal household following their father's death represented the ultimate institutionalization of James's romantic relationships. The Duke's sons were raised alongside Charles's own children in the royal nurseries, educated by the same tutors and treated as members of the royal family in all but name. This arrangement, unprecedented in English history, reflected the degree to which the Stuarts had come to view the Villiers as genuine relatives rather than merely favoured courtiers. The political consequences of James's romantic inclinations extended far beyond personal scandal or court intrigue. Parliament's growing assertiveness during his reign stemmed partly from resentment over the influence of favourites who seemed to wield power without accountability to anyone except the king's personal desires. The constitutional conflicts that would eventually explode into civil war under Charles I had their roots in the Jacobean court's unprecedented mixing of private affection and public authority. The religious dimensions of opposition to James's favourites reflected deeper anxieties about masculine sexuality and royal authority in Protestant England. Puritan critics argued that the king's unnatural relationships with beautiful young men represented a fundamental corruption of the godly monarchy they sought to establish. These attacks linked sexual deviance with political tyranny in ways that would influence English political discourse for generations. Continental observers viewed James's relationships with his favourites as evidence of English political decadence and weakness. French, Spanish, and papal diplomats reported extensively on what they saw as the corrupting influence of sexual passion on English statecraft, often using these observations to justify their own nation's aggressive policies toward Britain. James's private desires had become matters of international strategic importance. The legacy of James's relationships extended beyond immediate political consequences to influence the cultural and literary development of early modern England. The king's own poetry, much of it inspired by his male favourites, helped establish new conventions for expressing masculine emotion and desire. His court became a centre for theatrical productions that explored themes of male friendship, cross-dressing, and ambiguous sexuality that would influence Shakespeare, Marlowe, and their contemporaries. The patronage system that James established for his favourites created new pathways to power and influence that bypassed traditional noble hierarchies. Young men throughout the kingdom began cultivating the physical beauty, intellectual refinement, and courtly graces that might catch royal attention. This development had profound effects on English aristocratic culture, encouraging attention to personal appearance and artistic accomplishment that had previously been considered effeminate or foreign. The financial costs of James's generosity to his favourites contributed to the fiscal crisis that would plague English monarchy for generations. The enormous grants of land, money and monopolies lavished on Stuart, Carr and Buckingham drained royal resources while creating resentment among taxpayers who saw their money spent on what they viewed as the king's personal pleasures. Parliament's increasing reluctance to grant royal subsidies reflected growing awareness of how those funds were being used. The international implications of James's relationships became particularly acute during marriage negotiations for his children. Foreign courts questioned whether a king so obviously devoted to male companions could be trusted to pursue marriage alliances that served national rather than personal interests. The collapse of several important diplomatic initiatives was attributed partly to foreign suspicions about James's ability to maintain conventional royal priorities. The intelligence networks that developed around James's favourites created unprecedented opportunities for espionage and foreign interference in English affairs. Enemies of England quickly learned that access to the king required winning over his current favourite, leading to elaborate schemes to influence or corrupt these men. The security risks posed by James's emotional vulnerabilities became a constant concern for his advisors and a source of advantage for his enemies. The medical knowledge that surrounded James's relationships with his favourites reveals contemporary understanding of sexuality and health that differed dramatically from modern perspectives. Court physicians routinely advised the king about the physical and mental health effects of his intimate relationships, often recommending specific practices or warning against others based on classical medical theories about the balance of bodily humours and the dangers of excessive passion. The architectural changes made to royal palaces during James's reign reflected the practical requirements of his relationships with favourites. New chambers were constructed to allow private access between royal and favourite quarters, while existing layouts were modified to accommodate the unprecedented intimacy these relationships required. These physical changes to the built environment represented lasting monuments to James's romantic priorities. The impact on James's children of growing up in a court dominated by their father's male favourites created complex family dynamics that would influence the next generation of Stuart rule. Prince Charles, in particular, learned to navigate relationships with men like Buckingham, who served simultaneously as parental figures, political allies, and potential rivals for royal affection. These childhood experiences shaped his own understanding of monarchy and masculine friendship. The scholarly tradition that developed around James's court included numerous works dedicated to exploring the nature of masculine friendship and its role in good government. Philosophers and theologians produced treatises arguing that intense male bonds represented the highest form of human relationship, while critics countered with warnings about the political dangers of allowing personal affection to override public duty. These intellectual debates influenced European political thought for centuries. The artistic patronage that flowed from James's relationships with his favourites had lasting effects on English cultural development. Each favourite became a centre for poets, painters, musicians and scholars seeking royal attention, creating multiple competing courts within the larger royal household. This multiplication of patronage opportunities encouraged artistic innovation while also creating fierce rivalries that sometimes erupted into public scandals. The legal precedents established during trials related to James's favourites, particularly the Overbury murder case, influenced English criminal law for generations. Questions about the extent of royal immunity, the accountability of royal servants, and the relationship between private crimes and public office were explored in unprecedented detail. These legal discussions established principles that would be invoked during later constitutional crises. The psychological profile that emerges from detailed study of James's relationships reveals a complex personality shaped by childhood trauma, political necessity, and genuine emotional needs. Modern psychologists have suggested that his pattern of intense attachments followed by painful separations reflected deep-seated abandonment fears rooted in his early experiences of loss and betrayal. Yet these same vulnerabilities also enabled the genuine connections that made him a more effective ruler in many respects. The economic networks that developed around royal favourites created new forms of corruption and influence peddling that would plague English government for decades. The ability to purchase access to royal decision-making through payments to favourites undermined traditional systems of counsel and created incentives for the kinds of financial manipulation that would eventually contribute to civil war. Parliament's attempts to regulate these practices established important precedents for legislative oversight of royal finances. The religious debates sparked by James's relationships extended far beyond questions of personal morality to encompass fundamental theological issues about the nature of divine right monarchy. If the king truly ruled by God's will, as James claimed, then his personal relationships must also reflect divine approval. Critics argued that God would not endorse unnatural behavior, while supporters countered that royal prerogatives extended to all aspects of life, including love and friendship. The military implications of having royal favorites who lacked traditional martial experience created significant problems during James's later reign. Buckingham's appointment to military commands based on royal favor rather than proven competence led to expensive failures that damaged English prestige and treasury. These disasters highlighted the dangers of allowing personal affection to override professional qualifications in matters of national security. The diplomatic complications created by James's relationships affected England's international standing throughout his reign and beyond. Foreign courts learned to work through his favorites rather than traditional diplomatic channels, creating opportunities for manipulation while also bypassing established procedures for international communication. The resulting confusion contributed to several near wars and the breakdown of important alliances. The literary legacy of James's court, shaped by the king's own poetic efforts and the artistic patronage of his favorites, influenced English literature for generations. The exploration of themes related to masculine friendship, passionate devotion, and the conflicts between duty and desire found expression in countless works that helped establish new conventions for discussing intimate relationships between men. These literary developments occurred alongside broader European movements exploring similar themes. The educational reforms promoted by James and his favorites, particularly their emphasis on classical learning and continental sophistication, helped transform English intellectual culture. The universities experienced unprecedented royal attention and financial support, while new schools were established to prepare young men for court service. These educational initiatives had lasting effects on English scholarly achievement and cultural development. The fashion and lifestyle innovations introduced by James's favorites influenced English aristocratic culture far beyond the immediate court circle. Buckingham, in particular, set new standards for masculine beauty, dress, and deportment that were imitated throughout the kingdom. These cultural changes reflected broader European trends, but took on distinctively English characteristics that would influence national identity for generations. The administrative changes necessitated by the unprecedented power of royal favorites created new governmental structures that outlasted the individuals who inspired them. Offices created specifically to manage favorite influence, new procedures for handling royal grants and appointments, and modified systems for controlling access to the king all represented institutional innovations that would influence English government long after James's death. The provincial effects of James's relationships with favorites extended far beyond London and the royal court. Local magnates throughout England learned to cultivate connections with current favorites as a means of influencing royal policy, creating new networks of patronage and obligation that reshaped regional politics. These changes had particularly significant effects in areas where traditional noble families found themselves bypassed by favorite influence. The technological and scientific developments supported by James and his favorites reflected their shared interests in innovation and learning. The court became a center for experimenting with new mechanical devices, supporting early scientific research and promoting technological innovation. These activities contributed to broader European developments in natural philosophy while also serving the practical needs of royal administration. The commercial implications of favorite influence created new opportunities for trade and industry while also generating complaints about unfair monopolies and privileges. Merchants and manufacturers who gained royal attention through favorite connections found themselves advantaged over competitors, leading to legal challenges and parliamentary investigations that established important precedents for regulating royal economic policy. The dynastic consequences of James's relationships became clear only with the passage of time and the unfolding of subsequent English history. The political innovations, constitutional precedents, and cultural changes initiated during his reign created conditions that would contribute to civil war, revolution, and ultimately the transformation of English monarchy. His personal choices had effects that extended far beyond his own lifetime. James III's secret life, with his male courtiers, thus represents far more than a footnote to English history or a curiosity about royal sexuality. These relationships fundamentally altered the nature of English monarchy, created new forms of political power, and established cultural precedents that would influence British society for centuries. The king who dared to love openly in an age of rigid convention left a legacy that extended far beyond the romantic poetry and passionate letters that first revealed his secret desires. The man who wore all four crowns of the United Kingdom was also a human being who loved deeply, suffered greatly, and refused to separate his personal needs from his public role. In doing so, he created both opportunities and problems that would echo through generations, reminding us that even the most powerful rulers remain subject to the fundamental human need for love, companionship, and emotional connection. His story stands as testimony to the enduring power of the human heart to shape history, even when that heart beats within the breast of an absolute monarch.